My name is Amelia, and I'm 43 years old. If I had to describe my life, I'd call it peaceful, predictable. Some might even say dull. I've spent the last decade in a quiet rhythm, editing manuscripts by day, reading by night, and savoring the small, steady routines that filled my world. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when life felt bright, chaotic, and full of possibility. But years of disappointments, heartbreak, and the creeping inevitability of time had dulled those edges. I didn't mind, or at least, that's what I told myself. That's why it came as such a shock when everything changed one rainy afternoon. I ducked into my favorite cafe on the corner, escaping the drizzle and hoping for a moment of warmth. The place was nearly empty, the hum of soft jazz blending with the faint clink of cups and murmured conversation. I slid into my usual seat by the window, ordering my customary tea, ready to lose myself in the novel I'd brought along. And then I saw him. He was seated at the far end of the room, a coffee cup in one hand, a leather-bound notebook in the other. His hair was dark and slightly messy, his features sharp yet boyish. But it was his presence that caught me, something effortless, magnetic. I couldn't explain it, but from the moment my eyes landed on him, I felt it. I tried to focus on my book, but my gaze kept drifting back to him. He was writing something, his pen moving quickly across the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. He paused now and then, glancing out the window as if searching for inspiration. I was mesmerized. When he finally stood to leave, I felt an inexplicable pull, like I'd lose something precious if I let him walk away without knowing more. So, without thinking, I gathered my things and followed him. It was reckless, foolish even, but I couldn't stop myself. I trailed him at a safe distance, watching as he strolled down the street, pausing to admire a display in a bookstore window. He seemed so at ease, so unhurried, as if the world bent to his pace. For 3 days, I found excuses to return to the same cafe, hoping he'd reappear. And each day he did, I began to notice patterns. The way he always ordered a cappuccino, the way he carried that same notebook, the way his eyes would scan the room before settling into his seat. I wasn't just watching him, I was learning him. And in the process, I started to feel something I hadn't in years alive. I didn't understand it, not fully. Was it curiosity, infatuation, or something deeper, something I didn't dare name? All I knew was that this man, this stranger, had awakened a part of me I'd thought was long buried. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. And as I sat there on the 3rd day, watching him glance around the cafe with what I swore was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, I realized I wasn't the only one noticing. Something was about to change. I could feel it. By the 4th day, I was sure he'd noticed me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Surely a man like him wouldn't be paying attention to a woman like me. But the way his eyes lingered when he scanned the room, the faintest hint of a smile that tugged at his lips when our gazes accidentally met, it felt deliberate. That morning, I arrived earlier than usual, determined to get there before him. I chose a table near the back, where I could see everything without feeling conspicuous. When he walked in, I held my breath. He moved with the same unhurried grace, his leather notebook tucked under his arm, his fingers brushing his hair back as he ordered his cappuccino. But this time, when he turned to find a seat, his eyes locked on mine. It wasn't fleeting or accidental, it was intentional. I felt a jolt, as if he'd seen straight through me. I looked away quickly, pretending to be engrossed in my book, but my hands trembled as I turned the page. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him sit a few tables away, close enough that I could hear the faint scratch of his pen against paper. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were a mess, my pulse racing. Was he looking at me? Was this all just in my head? The next hour passed in a haze of stolen glances and silent electricity. I noticed how he tapped his pen lightly against the table when he paused to think, how his lips pressed together in concentration as he wrote. I noticed everything, and each detail only deepened the strange pull I felt toward him. When he stood to leave, my heart sank. But as he walked past my table, he hesitated for just a moment. Our eyes met again, and this time, his smile was unmistakable, soft, warm, and just shy of daring. I couldn't help but smile back, though my heart thundered in my chest. He didn't say a word, didn't stop, but that moment felt like a promise. The next day, I didn't even pretend I wasn't waiting for him. I chose a table near the window, the light streaming in and casting everything in a golden glow. When he arrived, he spotted me immediately. This time, he didn't sit across the room. Instead, he chose a table right beside mine. I could hardly breathe as he settled in, pulling out his notebook and pen. For several minutes, we sat in silence, each pretending to be absorbed in our own worlds. But the air between us felt charged, as if an invisible thread had tied us together. When I dared to glance at him, I caught him looking at me, his expression unreadable but undeniably interested. My cheeks burned, and I quickly looked away, but not before noticing the faint curve of amusement on his lips. It was maddening, this game of stolen glances and silent exchanges. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Two strangers sitting in a cafe, neither brave enough to break the silence, yet so clearly aware of each other. But there was something comforting in the quiet, something that felt right. As I walked home that evening, his face lingered in my mind. I didn't know his name, his story, or even his voice, but I felt as though I'd known him for years. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something bloom inside me, a quiet hope, fragile but impossible to ignore. The next morning, I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My hair was carefully styled, my makeup subtly enhancing features I hadn't thought to highlight in years. My usual plain cardigan had been replaced by a soft blouse, the kind that made me feel just a touch more alive. I wasn't just going to the cafe, I was preparing for something more. When I arrived, I was both relieved and nervous to see him already there. He was sitting at his usual spot by the window, his cappuccino steaming beside him, his notebook open. But something was different today. He seemed restless, his eyes drifting toward the door every few moments. When our eyes met, his entire demeanor shifted. His face lit up, and for a moment, I felt like the only person in the room. Before I could lose my nerve, I took a deep breath and walked to his table. "Do you mind if I sit here?" I asked, my voice betraying a tremor of both excitement and fear. He looked up at me, surprised but undeniably pleased. "Not at all," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. As I settled into the chair, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and vulnerability. Here I was, sitting across from the man who'd unknowingly disrupted my quiet little world, and I had no idea what to say. He spoke first. "I've seen you here before," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "I was beginning to think you'd never say hello." I laughed nervously, my hands fidgeting with the edge of my scarf. "I could say the same about you." His smile widened, and just like that, the tension melted away. We talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing as if we'd done this 100 times before. I learned his name, Adrian, and that he was a writer, working on his second novel. He asked about me, and I told him about my work as an editor, about my love of books, about the quiet life I'd built for myself. By the time we finished our coffees, I felt lighter, more open, as if the walls I'd carefully constructed around myself had begun to crumble. As we stood to leave, he hesitated. "Would you like to meet here again tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Yes," I said, the word escaping before I could think too hard about it. The following day we met again, and the day after that, until meeting Adrian became the part of my routine I looked forward to most. But the more time we spent together, the more I felt the weight of an unspoken question pressing down on me. Could I take this further? Could I dare to let him into my world, my home, my life? The answer came one evening after we'd lingered far too long at the cafe, laughing over stories from his childhood. The sky had darkened, and the chill of the evening air reminded me that I'd have to walk home alone. "Would you like to come over?" I asked suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Adrian blinked, clearly surprised, but his expression quickly softened. "I'd love to," he said, his smile reassuring me that I hadn't made a mistake. As we walked to my apartment, my heart raced with a mixture of excitement and terror. I couldn't believe I'd been bold enough to invite him, to take this step into the unknown. But as we reached my door and I turned the key, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was the beginning of something I could no longer deny. The moment Adrian stepped into my apartment, I felt the vulnerability of it all. My home was my sanctuary, a reflection of who I was, a space filled with books, soft lighting, and little reminders of a life lived quietly. And now here he was walking into it, carrying with him an energy that felt so different, so alive. "It's cozy," he said, looking around with genuine curiosity. His eyes landed on the bookshelf that nearly took up an entire wall, and his smile widened. I should have guessed. I laughed nervously, closing the door behind him. What can I say? Books make the best company. We settled on the couch, a glass of wine in each of our hands, the soft hum of music playing in the background. At first, we talked the way we always did. Easily, comfortably. But there was an undercurrent now, something neither of us could ignore. Adrian leaned back, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver through me. "You know," he said softly, "I'm glad you spoke to me that day. I've been hoping you would." "You have?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his smile tinged with something deeper. "There's something about you, Amelia. Something that feels familiar. Like I've known you longer than I actually have." I didn't know what to say. No one had looked at me like that in years, if ever. And no one had ever said anything that made me feel so seen. I felt a tug inside me, a mix of fear and longing. "I'm not sure what it is about you either," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But I feel it too." Adrian's hand moved to mine, his touch warm and steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with possibilities. And then, without thinking, I leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters of something neither of us could predict. But it didn't stay that way for long. The moment deepened, our breaths mingling, our hands finding their way to each other as the world outside my apartment seemed to vanish. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that felt raw and unguarded. I could feel the years of loneliness and self-doubt melting away, replaced by something I hadn't dared to hope for. Desire, warmth, and a sense of being truly alive. Adrian pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. I nodded, a tear slipping down my cheek before I could stop it. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again. His thumb brushed my cheek, wiping away the tear. "You deserve to feel this way. And more." We stayed there, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the moment linger. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to plan or overthink. For now, it was enough to let the walls fall and to feel. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the room. For a moment, I lay still, letting the warmth of the moment settle in. Adrian's arm was draped lightly over me, his breathing slow and steady. I hadn't felt this kind of intimacy in years, not just the closeness of two bodies but the quiet comfort of being with someone who felt like they understood me, without words. As much as I wanted to stay in that moment forever, reality began creeping in. Doubts whispered at the edges of my mind. What was I doing? Could this really be something lasting? Or was I just indulging in a fleeting fantasy? I shifted slightly, careful not to wake him, and my eyes fell on his leather-bound notebook sitting on the coffee table. The source of so many of my initial curiosities. I wondered what stories or secrets it held, what pieces of his life I hadn't yet uncovered. As if sensing my thoughts, Adrian stirred, his voice groggy but warm. "Morning." I turned to face him, unable to suppress a smile. "Good morning." He propped himself up on one elbow, his hair adorably messy, and studied me for a moment. "You're thinking too much," he said, a teasing glint in his eyes. I laughed softly, but he wasn't wrong. "I guess I'm just trying to make sense of all this." Adrian sat up, his expression growing serious. "You don't have to make sense of it, Amelia. Not right now. Let it be what it is." His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within me. For years, I'd lived my life carefully, trying to make sense of everything, to control every detail so nothing could catch me off guard. And yet here I was, diving headfirst into something I couldn't predict or define. And it was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. "I don't know how to just let go," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Adrian reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Then we'll figure it out together." The vulnerability in his words disarmed me. He wasn't asking for guarantees or promises. He wasn't expecting me to be anything other than myself, flaws, doubts, and all. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, beautifully. We made breakfast together, laughing over burnt toast and scrambled eggs. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of ourselves we hadn't yet revealed. He told me about his childhood, about how he'd always wanted to be a writer, even when it felt impractical. I told him about my love for editing, about how I found comfort in helping others shape their stories while quietly ignoring my own. By the time the sun began to set, I felt lighter, freer. Adrian wasn't just someone I'd noticed in a cafe. He was someone who saw me, who challenged me to see myself in a way I hadn't dared to in years. As we sat together on the couch, his arm around my shoulders and my head resting against his chest, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about him. This was about me, about rediscovering a part of myself I thought I'd lost. And maybe, just maybe, about giving myself permission to embrace the unknown, to believe that love could find me in the most unexpected of ways. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was willing to try. The days that followed felt like a quiet revolution. Every moment with Adrian deepened the connection between us, but it also revealed something profound within myself. I had spent so many years buried in routine, in the comfort of familiarity, that I had forgotten what it felt like to truly feel alive. Adrian's presence in my life reminded me of that feeling, not just in the rush of passion or the intimacy of our conversations, but in the simple moments we shared, each one carrying the potential for growth, for rediscovery. We spent more time together, afternoons walking through the city, evenings at his apartment, and weekends cooking meals together in mine. I'd always been cautious, reserved, but with Adrian I let go. The walls I'd carefully built over the years, those walls of fear, of self-doubt, slowly crumbled. There was no need to hide anymore. I didn't need to pretend that everything was perfect, or that I had it all figured out. What I had with Adrian was raw, real, and far more beautiful than anything I could have planned. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of his apartment, the sky above painted in hues of pink and orange, I turned to him with a question that had been on my mind for a while. "What do you think love is?" He smiled softly, his eyes searching mine as if he could see the depths of my soul. "Love is messy, Amelia. It's not about having all the answers. It's about showing up, being there for each other, even when things are uncertain." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words settle in my chest. Love wasn't perfect. It wasn't about fitting into some idealized version of a relationship. It was about acceptance, about being brave enough to embrace the imperfections, the vulnerabilities, the unknowns. As the weeks passed, I began to realize that what I had with Adrian was not some fleeting romance, but a gift. A chance to reawaken parts of myself I had neglected, to embrace the beauty of life in all its unpredictable glory. And yes, there were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of our age difference or the societal expectations we carried felt heavy. But those moments didn't scare me anymore. I had learned that love didn't follow a script. It was a journey that didn't need to make sense. One evening, as we sat in the park, our hands intertwined, I looked at Adrian with a sense of quiet awe. "I don't know what the future holds," I whispered, "but I know that right now, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." He squeezed my hand, his voice filled with the same certainty I felt in my bones. "I feel the same way, Amelia. No matter where this journey takes us, we'll figure it out together." And for the first time in years, I believed him. Love, I realized, wasn't something that could be planned or predicted. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about following your heart, wherever it led you. It was about embracing the unexpected, and in doing so, finding something deeper than I had ever imagined. I had rediscovered myself, not through logic or reason, but through the courage to take a leap into the unknown. And in that leap, I had found a love that was more profound than I ever thought possible, an unexpected, beautiful gift that had changed everything. As I looked at Adrian, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready. Because this love, this journey, was worth every uncertain step.